El tema que vamos a tratar el día de hoy, tendencias globales en la gestión de riesgos de la seguridad y riesgos críticos. En esta oportunidad tenemos a Glenn Leil, que viene de Canadá. Él es ingeniero de profesión, tiene un máster y tiene un doctorado en ingeniería de minería de la Universidad de Quebec en Kingston. A lo largo de su carrera trabajó por 33 años en Vale, anteriormente INCO, en capacitación en ingeniería, operaciones de seguridad. En el 2009 se incorporó al Centro de Excelencia de Innovación de Minería como director de investigación y desarrollo, gestionando proyectos de investigación colaborativa. Durante los últimos 5 años ha trabajado como director de Mirarco Mining Innovation, en una organización sin fines de lucro ubicada en el campus de la Universidad de Luisiana, proporcionando soluciones innovadoras para los beneficios de la industria minera y otras industrias en general. Por favor, quisiera que comencemos con la mejor actitud. Démosle un fuerte aplauso a Glenn para que haga su presentación.
Buenos dias. Good morning. And unfortunately, that's about the only Spanish that I understand. It's very much a pleasure to be here today. And as you likely sensed from the introduction, I spent all of my career at INCO, now Vale, in the engineering and the operations. So I went over most of the roles that many of you likely hold. And I wanted to share with you today some of the things that I learned from, or some of the things that I wish I'd known when I was in operations. The comments that I would like to make today are essentially all within my experience within Canada and the US. So unfortunately, I don't understand, or I don't know your operations as well, but I'm sure there's some
pero estoy seguro de que hay bastantes similitudes en lo que yo les voy a describir y lo que sucede en Estados Unidos y Canadá. Hay 3 partes en la presentación. Una es hablarles acerca del avance y el progreso en la reducción de accidentes. Creo que esto está sucediendo a nivel mundial.
Globalization of safety management best practice and safety professionalism. Tom Heffman was scheduled to present today. Unfortunately, he was called away on business and couldn't attend. I've used some of his slides in the presentation, and he wanted to express his regrets for not being able to attend and to wish you well on the success of your conference. I'll say a little bit about Merarco. Merarco is a wholly owned subsidiary of Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. And we have 5 different areas that we focus on. The mining safety research, of which I am a part and lead. Okay, see the timer is on. Geohazard assessment and risk management, ventilation and production, optimization, an energy section, and then a climate adaptation session. If we look at lost time injury frequency over the last 20 years, what's our trend been? I also want you to think about what's our fatality frequency been over the last 20 years. And again, I think these are pretty well global trends. And if we look at them in general, I think we've all made very significant reductions in lost time injuries. And we've made fewer reductions, or the rate of reductions in fatalities has been less. If we look at some ICMM statistics, and if you look at the last 5-year period, you can see that although the number has fluctuated in terms of per year, the fatality frequency rate is essentially flat. And over the last 5 years, there's certainly been a very concerted effort and concentration on how to reduce fatalities within our organizations, within our industry. So why? Why are we still having high rates of fatalities within our industry? First of all, we work with large energy sources. They're very unforgiving. Secondly, I think a lot of the tools that we have used for other incidents, and by other incidents I mean less catastrophic type injuries or incidents, have not been as effective for fatalities. But also, and this is my opinion, we've had an over-reliance on behavioral-based safety. We've expected behavioral-based safety to be our savior in this. And this is certainly true in the organization that I worked with for numbers of years, that we were relying upon behavioral-based safety and not looking at how else we could make improvements. So what can we do? Correct worker behavior is and always will be important. You need the proper behavior, but we need to add in a strong systems approach to risk management. As Emily was talking about in her talk yesterday, the management or the systems management component is a very important piece of safety risk management. I'm assuming most of you have seen the beloved Heinrich pyramid during the course of your careers. This one happens to be the one that INCO modified for their use. You might note the rusty staples on the bottom of it, because this is the one that I happen to used to carry around in my underground clothes. The key point that I want to make with this is this has driven a lot of our safety work over the past decades, particularly in the organization that I worked with. And there was a strong belief that if you could reduce the bottom of the pyramid, that you would reduce the fatalities. And I think history has shown us, and certainly our trend rate has shown us, that this is not the case. That there is a numerical relationship between the numbers in the different types of consequences. However, you're not going to reduce fatalities by eliminating the bottom of the pyramid. What I think we need to do in the future, and part of what I'm going to be talking about today, is we need to focus on what can cause the fatals. Search them out, understand them, examine the controls that we have for them, put in the proper controls, and then monitor the controls. And I also believe that the process of doing that will definitely make changes through all the others. So basically, I'm proposing that what we need to do is to change our focus from looking at the bottom of the pyramid to looking at the top of the pyramid. Work with the top, it'll make changes throughout, including the bottom. If I look at global best practices, and I'm going to cover these next 5 points in the next part of the presentation. What are the global best practices at the moment? The first is the use of a well-defined risk assessment process with standards. Second is the utilization of a 4-layer model for risk assessment. The third, recognize that safety maturity is a journey. Fourth, understanding the role of controls. And fifth, understanding the role of critical controls. Mining definitely is becoming very globalized. If I look at the Canadian industry, we don't have independent mining companies as we did when I started out my career in the 70s. Now they're part of global companies, very large companies, much more difficult to influence. So the comments on the slide, mining companies around the world are conveying on common strategy for safety and health. Definitely very true. Why is it important? We can certainly improve the industry's ability to assess what works and what doesn't. It can allow for company-specific variations in implementation. And it allows for improved collaboration and greater acceptance of best practice and sharing of incident information. However, I don't believe we do a very good job at this, particularly the last bullet on improving collaboration, acceptance of best practice, and sharing of incident information. Certainly in Canada, we have a very difficult time in sharing of serious incidents. Our friendly lawyers get involved and provide or prevent us from talking to each other unless it's in a very, very informal basis to describe incidents. And I believe personally that if we're going to make significant changes within fatalities within our industry, we need to be able to break through this barrier and to be able to share much more freely what some of the major incidents are that take place and how we can prevent them. Because there's many similarities in the incidents that happen. If you look at the fatalities that have occurred in my country or in the US or Australia, and I'm not as familiar with the ones that you may have here, but I'm willing to bet that there's about a 60% commonality in the types of incidents that occur. We continue to repeat the same incidents. And we've got to break this trend. If we're serious about reducing fatalities, we need to find a way to move, and I hope there's not many lawyers in the audience, but we need to move the lawyers out of the way and be able to share information freely as to what we need. Use of risk assessment. Very much globally recognized as the first necessary step in the journey to improving risk management or safety risk management within an industry. In 2017, Ontario in Canada introduced legislation requiring mining companies to undertake risk assessments. This was the first time that it became in the legislation in any of the provinces in Canada. And companies' progress on this has been very much a scattered approach. And there's many, many lessons to be learned from this particular exercise that we undertook. Not all of them were successful. So there's many things that I think as organizations, as countries look to try to make improvements in risk management, there's many things that we can learn from what others have done. And yet, there's a reluctance to learn from what others have done. I love this slide. It was provided to me by Jim Joy out of Australia. And it talks about the benefits of risk management. And as you see on the graph, and I need to point out two things on the graph, the red line is the number of employees, and the blue line is the fatalities. And so, as the text says, for 25 years, the Queensland coal mines have applied risk management. And if you look at the graph, starting in about the year 2000, the fatality rate has gone from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 30,000. And there's been no disasters in the last 20 years. And the definition of disasters that they're using is where there's multiple fatalities that have occurred, such as from a spontaneous combustion, a flood, a rock fall, etc. So with an average of 30,000 employees in the past 20 years, that's a savings of 5 lives per year for 20 years, or 100 individuals. Now, to me, that is the benefit of having a defined, well-thought-through risk assessment program. I'm going to very briefly talk about some risk assessment tools. And I'm going to break them into 3 different groups because I find it very easy to look at them in those 3 lenses. First, tools that you use at the face, first level tools, second level tools. And I'm sure that they're not going to be unfamiliar to this group. So, first level tools involving a worker, a supervisor. You have many different types that are out there, many different names for them, 5-point, take 5, slam, etc. But they're all intended to do one thing. They're intended to get the individual to do an if-then. And you're trying to get the individual to move from an operational to a tactical thinking mode. You want them to get into the workplace, you want them to look at it, and they make the assessment to say, if these are my conditions, these are my tools, this is my procedure that I have, then can I finish the work safely? And you get them just to stop, pause, and have that discussion. You move into the second level of tools, RACs, FMEA, FMECAs, HAZOPs, etc. And they're basically the first level of analysis. They're a team-based assessment used for the evaluation of multiple unwanted events, basically to develop a risk ranking. You can use these tools to find where do we have the greatest risk within our organization. And completion of the tools is measured in hours. Then we move into the second level of tools. You've got fault tree. Oh, I should go back for a second. So where are these applicable? The RAC is essentially a very good general purpose tool that can be used in a wide variety of situations. It's personally my favorite. FMEAs is around components and looking at the life of components. What if something fails within this component, what would be the impact? And HAZOP is a very useful tool for fixed installations. I always think of pumps, tanks, etc. with HAZOP, where you have a fixed operation. Then you move into the second level of analysis, fault trees, logic trees, event trees, and my personal favorite, the bow tie. And the bow tie has essentially been adopted and promoted through the ICMM, and I'll be talking about the ICMM a little bit more later, the Industrial Council of Metal Miners. And it's an excellent tool for examining serious, high-consequence, unwanted events. Now, don't be fooled by trying to use the bow tie in all situations. The bow tie should only be used in situations where you're looking at unwanted events that could result in single or multiple fatalities. That's the level of consequence where a bow tie is very, very, very applicable. So you're doing a very detailed analysis of one unwanted event. You're going to be able to do the analysis to determine whether the incident is now at a state of a LARA or a LARUP, whichever word you choose to use. And the completion of a bow tie is normally measured in days. It is not a quick event. You will need to take time to do it properly. And if you don't do it properly, don't bother doing it. And at the end of the day, you're going to be putting it into some sort of risk matrix. And there's many, many variations of this one. This one lists it in terms of priorities. So the one that's a major and almost certain is listed as a number 1, as a high priority. The reverse of this, which you'll also see, is that could also have a ranking of a 25. It just depends which way the risk matrix is formatted, whether it's priorities or whether it's risk ranking numbers. The key point to remember with this, it's about finding the priorities. It's about finding those events that you want to do more work with it's not about tolerance. The 5x5 risk matrix does not give you, yes, it's okay to proceed. So it's not a green is go and a red is stop. That's not the purpose of the 5x5. Oftentimes, a lot of companies will draw a line between the 3 and the 4, where 4 is normally, 4 consequence, is normally determined as a single fatality, and a 5 consequence is multiple fatalities. And a lot of organizations say anything as either a 4 or a 5 will be given a bow tie analysis. Because of the consequence level, they want that level of detail in the analysis. 4-layer risk management. I'm assuming many of you have seen a similar type of diagram in the past, and there's many variations of this out in the industry. But the difference, the key things are you use the tools slightly differently within the different layers. So it's a focus. Across layer number 1, you're looking across the whole organization. I like to think of it as you're trying to cast a net or a coarse filter through the organization. And what you want to find is those big events that could result in fatalities, serious consequences within the organizations. So that's the purpose of the first layer. Find those big things that could go wrong. Layer number 2 is around what are we changing? If we're changing something, then we need to have analysis of it. It might be bumped up back to layer number 1 and you use the same tools, or you might use similar tools. Layer number 3, routine, non-routine task planning. What you're looking at doing is trying to develop workplace practices that have taken into account the risk assessment and the controls that are necessary to complete the job safely. And then you get down to the bottom layer and you're looking at individual or continuous risk assessments. If it's done properly and all 4 layers are employed, as you're moving through the layers, you are decreasing the risk because you have addressed the risk in the higher layers. The outcomes of the risk management 4-layer is in layer number 1, you're coming up with risk registers, actions, identification of your high-risk events. Layer number 2, again, plans and actions for the changes that are being implemented or proposed. Layer number 3, routine work processes. You're looking at safe work methods. What are the procedures that we need to put in place? And layer number 4 is all around personal awareness. Remember the if-then. If these are the conditions, the tools, the procedures that I have to work with, can I complete the work safely? And you see that most of your opportunity for behavioral pieces are in the bottom 2 layers. Top 2 layers gives you the opportunity to look at the design and engineering to make improvements. And if I think back to one of my earlier slides where I said the focus on behavioral safety, certainly in the case of INCO in the days when I was working with them, we were not looking at layers number 1 and 2 at all. We were not looking at the design and the engineering. We would continually, if there was an incident, our first choice was, well, we'll create another procedure. We'll look at the worker, because the worker obviously made the mistake. And we never looked, and you know, the old saying, if you point your hand at someone, there's actually 3 fingers pointing back at you. We weren't looking at that enough to say, well, what are we doing in terms of the design of our work? Are we using the right equipment? Are we using the right procedures, et cetera? So we were not helping in trying to make things better. We were actually making them worse because we were layering procedure upon procedure and continuing to blame the workers. So I think this was a very important realization that I had, that you really need to look at the design of the work. Is it proper? Is the equipment proper, et cetera? And it's not just the worker. The next piece is understanding that there's a risk management maturity. And I think where this is exceedingly helpful is in allowing an organization to understand where they are in the journey and what's next. Now, this particular journey goes through the steps of basic, reactive, compliant, proactive, and resilient. Many different organizations still use the 5 steps. They call them different names, which doesn't matter, but it's looked at as the 5 steps. And if you look at the different steps, and I'll just go over the top heading, where you're moving from a no-care culture to a blame culture, compliance, ownership, or it being a way of life. Many of our organizations, you can plot them as to where they are on that roadmap. And it's a journey. And you're not going to move from a no-care culture to having it a way of life overnight. It's likely a 5 to 7 year continual hard work, very hard work, to make that move. But if you're making the move, you will see improvements within your operations and your safety, and certainly your efficiency and the costs of your operations. Because I think we need to look at safety as it's really a defect. And we all know that if you can eliminate defects from our operations, we will have much more efficient operations. So I won't go over the other titles that are here. You can look at the change in terms of risk assessment, in terms of investigation, in terms of auditing. Each of them have the various steps. The organization that I work for also has an education program, which I'll talk very briefly about as well. But what they've done is they've looked at the people aspects and the systems aspects within the context of this journey and looked at the 23 different elements and trying to help organizations understand where they are, and most importantly then, what do they need to do next to advance to the next step. So the GMIRM, which is the Global Minerals Industry Risk Management Program, it was essentially developed by Jim Joy out of the University of Queensland in Australia. And although I'm Canadian, I hate to admit it, but I believe the Australians are basically #1 in safety risk management in the world. They're certainly doing much better, and I think we've got a lot to learn from them and have taken many lessons from them. But they developed this program, and it was to initiate an change in operational risk management through the improvement of understanding and to challenge the way people, managers, look at it. Now, it's available in 4 levels, and I didn't put this on as an advertisement, but whatever program that you're looking at putting in, it's so important to go through all of your layers of management. Where we've had success in implementing any sort of a change is definitely we would start with the executives so that they understand what's involved. Then to the managers, and I define a manager as a 2nd level supervisor, then the supervisors. The lowest one should be delivered internally by the organization themselves. And the key thing is you've got to hit all 3 areas, actually all 4 areas, including the workers. And if you don't, your program won't be effective. So if you're embarking on any program that you're looking at, and regardless whether it's GMERM or not, you need to ensure that you're going to, I want to use the word attack, and maybe it is attack, but you need to approach and make sure all 4 layers are united in what you're looking at doing. If you don't, it will fail. This was a slide that Tom provided for me, and essentially it's a bit of a simplification of the 5 steps of the journey, and he's called them 3 waves. And I think it's very useful to say, okay, if you look at the first wave, you're moving from regulations, internal standards, auditing, risk management, management systems, behaviors, down to a cultural enhancement. And those are sort of some of the key things that you're going to do along your journey. Now, I'd like to look at it perhaps a slightly different way, and if I go into an organization, these are sort of the 3 questions that I try to hear from the organization as to allow me to assess where are they on their particular journey. And the first is, do they use hazard and risk interchangeably? Or do they understand the difference between hazard and risk? The second part is in the role of controls. Do they understand the role that controls play in reducing or mitigating the risk? And the third part of it is, do they understand that controls need to be managed? So I find those 3 questions as a very useful guide to understand where an organization is in terms of their risk management journey. Critical control management. Now, critical control management is not the silver bullet. It's not the magical solution to making things safer within an organization. And I want to talk about that in a lot more detail. Again, this was, as Jim Joy quotes in here, it's the next phase in managing minerals industry operational risk. I believe the statement, critical controls has a very big role to play, but it's not a magical solution. If you look at ICMM members, and the slide's a little outdated because I think there's a couple more members that have joined in the meantime, but there's some very large global companies in here. And these are the 2 publications that are available for free on the web on the use of critical controls. Now, if you think back to some of these organizations that are on this page, there are a number of those organizations that have Spanish operations, or Spanish-speaking operations, I should say. So I'm sure there's got to be Spanish interpretation or Spanish editions of these 2 guides. And I would encourage you to search these out and to use them because they are excellent guides that are available. I see a few heads that are nodding in the room, so they know that they are available. So if you look at, and this is an ICMM quote, the top factors for why fatalities, serious injuries, serious diseases, and high potential incidents occur are due to people not properly identifying risks, controls not being in place, or the controls are not being effectively implemented or maintained. I want to highlight one other piece in here, and that's on serious diseases. Certainly it was my experience in my working career that it was very difficult to get even the workers engaged in being part of an occupational health prevention program. getting them to understand the importance of wearing hearing protection, wearing respiratory protection where required, or trying to prevent dust getting into the atmosphere to begin with, was a continual uphill battle, even with my own safety and health team. And we always look at the immediate causes. We're looking at what happened today. Someone slipped, injured themselves, broke their ankle. We don't think about the environment that we put that individual into for 20 years that may result in their having respiratory problems during the last of their life. And I think it's a focus within the industry that we definitely need to change. It's hard work because it takes time to get people to understand the significance of it. And there is somewhat of a macho image within the mining industry that they're tough and we can take this, but we need to break that down. We really need to try to look at how we can look at the total health of our individuals and not just the acute type injuries that they may have. I'm not going to go into the next few slides on critical controls in a lot of depth. Again, this is all out of that blue document that I showed a few slides ago. The key points to highlight in it is between step number 1 and step number 5 is all around planning the process and undertaking the bow tie. From 5 around to 9, it's all around defining what the parameters are for the operation of the controls, who's going to monitor them, how do we follow up on it, how do we do it. And the point I'm trying to make is if you're thinking about critical controls, it is a big project. It's not a small project at all. You need to be very careful on how you define what the controls need to be, how you're going to monitor it, who's going to be doing the monitoring, and how will we know when the controls are slipping out of control, if you will. So it's a big piece of work. Very worthwhile. Don't misunderstand me. Use of critical controls is very useful, but there's a lot of work around it. There's not a shortcut. And I'm afraid there's a lot of companies, certainly there's a lot of companies that I've worked with that see it as a shortcut. Target steps for each of the operations. Again, I won't go into all of those. They're listed very well in the book. But I will talk about this one just a little bit. Again, this is out of the book because there's a change in here from the way that we've defined controls in the past. And it's saying, number 1, the first diamond, is it a human act, object, or system? Next one, which is not changed, does it prevent, mitigate, recovery an unwanted asset? And thirdly, have the performance specifications been written in an audible and measurable means? But the new aspect of it is it's defining an act as something you can see a person do, monitor, or measure. So training and procedures are not controls. And that's a big change, because I've often done bow ties in the past, but we have a procedure for that. We have a training program for that. Object is a barrier and engineered device, and I'm going to come back to ACT in a minute. And a system is a combination of an object and an act. Those two, the object and the system definitions, are pretty well the same as what we've been using for a while. But with the act, something you can see a person do, monitor, or measure, they're not, training and procedure are not controls, but they provide the instructions on what the correct act is. And so the opportunity in this, and I think it's a very, very good change to the definition, because now it's saying in your training or in your procedures, you should be very clear on what the act is that you want the employee to do. And I think if in the past, and certainly a lot of the procedures and the training that I've been involved in has been very generic and not specific to the actions that we want the individual to take. So I think as we develop new training guidelines and new procedures, keep in mind that what's the desired outcome of this? The desired outcome of your training and your procedures is that that individual be able to undertake a specific act for a specific task. So it's requiring us to be much more specific and dedicated in terms of what we want the outcome to be. So I think there's certainly an opportunity to review the training and procedures to define that the act is clearly identified. So critical control caution, and I say caution, this isn't a don't do it, it's a understand what you're getting into. So success of a critical control program will depend upon the safety maturity of the organization. If an organization is not well advanced on their safety journey already, you shouldn't be talking about critical controls. It will not help you in the long term. And you need to understand that all controls are important and not just critical controls. I can't think of any bow tie work that I've done, and I've done quite a few of them, that you could come up with this one control. If we just do this, we'll prevent the unwanted event. It's never just one control. It's always a combination of controls. And I think this is the biggest danger with critical controls and the application of critical controls is you forget or could forget how important all the other controls are. And it requires a detailed an assessment, such as the bow tie. There are other tools that will give you the same results or similar results, but the bow tie tends to be the most recognized. And it's got to be a good quality bow tie. And I've seen some pretty lousy bow ties in the past. And most of them because we didn't have enough time to do it. We were forced into, we need to get it done within a certain period of time. And this is what we ended up with. And there's a high level of effort and commitment required because you're going to need to define what the controls are, what the specifications are of the controls, how you're going to monitor it, and most importantly, who's going to monitor it. So, last part of it, a critical control program must be part of a control management program. If you're not looking at all of your controls, as well as just the criticals, you're going to be in trouble because we don't have the luxury of only having one or two controls that will prevent our unwanted events. This table is out of the blue guideline that I talked about earlier from the ICMM. And it's a maturity curve for the use of controls. Now, I tend to describe it as likely the page in that book that receives the least amount of attention. Because companies want to jump into doing critical controls without the understanding of it. So if you're thinking of critical controls, please sit down, go through the guidelines, understand where your organization is on this particular chart, and then see, are you ready for it? And if you're not, what do you need to do to get ready for it? The last part of the talk that I want to concentrate on, and I must admit, I'm not as familiar with this part of it as Tom is. Tom is actually giving a talk at the Canadian Institute of Mining conference that is going to be occurring at the end of this month in Montreal, Canada. And Tom's going to be talking to our CIM members about the importance of this professional safety organization and what's going on. So this chart just lists all of the different designations that are taking place. And at the very bottom of the page, you're seeing in mining safety, the Certified Mine Safety Professional. And there's a body of knowledge that's being developed for this, which is fundamental knowledge of science and engineering, leadership, safety, health, and risk management, management systems, and professional skills. So there's an education component and an experience component that are being developed for it. To become a member, 10 years of experience, currently employed in a health and safety position, pledged to abide by a code of conduct, and there's an exam. This is being the SME, the Society of Mining Engineers in the US, has taken over the administration of this particular program. And they're definitely looking to make this more of an international organization and international code. And that's part of what Tom is going to be presenting to us at the CIM meeting, because they're interested in having the CIM be a part of this so that it can be more of a North American, and they've approached many other organizations to try to promote this. With that, it ends my talk.
Muy bien, vamos a pasar tenemos algún tiempo disponible para hacer algunas preguntas. Permítanme algunos apuntes que he podido tomar. Espero que ustedes se hayan tomado mejor que yo. Él habla de corregir el comportamiento de las personas. ¿Pero en qué momento? ¿En qué momento corregimos ese comportamiento? Ha venido la moda, seguridad basada en el comportamiento. Entonces, todos pero no sabemos cómo medir eso. Algo que es importante y creo que se ha dejado de lado es el intercambiar información. Porque nadie creo que es dueño de la verdad, además de la seguridad todo ya está creado, no hay mucho más que hacer, simplemente hay que ser creativos para que eso avance. Un programa bien definido basado en riesgos. Pero él dice que ese programa tiene que estar acorde con la cultura organizacional. Si no hay una cultura organizacional, ¿qué hacemos con estos riesgos, sobre todo los riesgos críticos? Luego, algo que en el Xxiii estamos siempre atentos es cómo medimos la capacitación. Ustedes nos piden capacitación, hacemos la capacitación, les entregamos la capacitación, pero ustedes son encargados de medir esa capacitación, de medir si está dando efecto, si es relevante para ustedes o no. ¿Bien? Entonces ahora, esas es modestamente mis reflexiones respecto al tema. Me gustaría ahora que pasemos rápidamente, levantemos la mano. Quien desea hacer preguntas, por favor, ahora sí, ahí está con el audífono. A ver, por allá, primera pregunta, por favor.
Buenos días. Me gustaría saber cómo la etapa de cómo mide la aplicación de los controles.
How do you measure the control application? Okay, in measuring the control application, you need to Have you defined the requirements of the control? You know, what is it looking to do? Have you written the specifications for the control? And including in the writing of the specifications of the control, have you described how you're going to monitor it? Who's going to monitor it? So that's how you would understand whether you're operating in control, or using the term control again, if your control is doing what you intended it to do. But often cases, we're not clear enough on what are the operational requirements of the control. So take your time, write out the specifications of the control. What do you expect out of it? How is it going to operate? Who's going to be monitoring it? And how will you know whether it goes out of its operational range?
Buenos días, muchas gracias por su interesante charla. ¿Pudiera ampliar su observación o crítica a la seguridad basada en comportamiento?
Could I speak about behavioral-based safety? Having the right behaviors is absolutely important. But it's my opinion that we put far too much faith in if we can just get the workers to do it correctly, it will be safe. And that's where I think we made the mistake. We did not look back at, did we design the task correctly? Did we design the right equipment for the task? Did we design the procedures properly? So behavior is very important, but I think it's only part of the puzzle. And we never looked, certainly from my experience in the organization that I worked with for 33 years, we didn't look far enough. We didn't look at, have we got the right equipment, the right procedures? Are we asking them to do it in the right way? That's why I say behavioral-based safety was only part of the puzzle. An important part, but only part of.
Marcelo Stoker. Bueno, como usted dijo, cuando se identifican estos bow tie y uno empieza con este proceso, salen muchos bow tie. Entonces, y por cada bow tie, a lo mejor 3 controles críticos, pero después, ¿cómo su experiencia para poder administrar esto en la implementación del día a día? ¿Qué herramienta recomienda usted?
I really don't have a tool that I could recommend to you of this is what you need to do. You are quite right. I mean, if you have done multiple bow ties and you've nominated 3 or 4 critical controls out of each bow tie, which is the ratio that everyone is suggesting is about right, it's difficult monitoring them. Definitely is difficult monitoring. There's an individual that I'm currently working with, and I can provide you his contacts after the conversation, if you will, that basically is trying to utilize a lot of the material, the data that we're already electronically collecting from our equipment, our workers, et cetera, to help monitor the specific controls. So you can look at what are the controls that we have. Now, what evidence of those controls operating correctly can we pull from the data that we're already collecting, and then be able to use that to understand whether we're moving or whether we're remaining in control or whether we're starting to drop out of control. And I can provide you that context later. But it's a lot of work, as I'm sure you understand. But it's a lot of work. However, if we want to get to the position where we can reasonably be assured that we're not going to have fatalities, it's the type of work that we have to do.
A ver, la última pregunta, si lo hubiera. ¿No? Ok. Por favor, no se muevan un momentito. Lo despedimos al expositor con un fuerte aplauso, por favor. ¿Por qué les he pedido que no se muevan? Me gustaría que reconozcamos a las empresas que hacen posible que este seminario cada vez lo hagamos con mucho cariño, lo hagamos cada vez mejor, podamos traer expositores de la talla que ustedes han podido presenciar. Es gracias a las empresas que vemos aquí. Bien, tenemos a los Quenuales, Golfis, Xxiii, Raura, Buenaventura, Minsur, Antapacay, Poderosa, Antamina, Nexa, Miracle City, Xxiii, Cerro Verde, AESA, Sauder, Perú. Pero aparte de que ellos nos auspician, nos ayudan a que este evento sea de la talla que ustedes se merecen, también nos apoyan con algo que ustedes y nosotros lo disfrutamos, que son los breaks. ¿Ah? ¿Sí o no? ¿Lo disfrutamos todos o no? Entonces, quisiera, por favor, si hay gente de Xxiii que se ponga de pie. Gente de Xxiii, por favor. No tengan miedo, no lo vamos a hacer, no lo vamos a sacar acá. Queremos agradecer a su empresa, porque gracias a su empresa ustedes van a disfrutar el break de este momento. Así que los espero, por favor, a las 10:30 nuevamente aquí en la sala. Muchas gracias. Espero que hayan disfrutado este break. Nuevamente el agradecimiento a Xxiii por esta entrega, por este aporte, esta ayuda al Instituto de Seguridad Minera. Muy bien. El tema que se va a tratar, si ustedes ven su programa, el título es bastante largo, ¿correcto? Dice: una mirada al futuro para mejoras significativas en la seguridad y la salud de la minería a través de investigaciones innovadoras y una difusión efectiva en la industria. Bien. El profesional que tenemos el honor de tener este día, en este momento, es Xxiii Kohler, nos visita de Estados Unidos. Xxiii es profesor y presidente de Ingeniería en Minería, dueño de George H. Jr., dicta cátedra en Ingeniería Minera en Penn State. Su carrera de 45 años ha incluido posiciones en industria, gobierno y academia. Fue director de la Oficina Minera de Seguridad e Investigación Sanitaria de CDC, Instituto Nacional de Seguridad y Sanidad Ocupacional, NIOSH. En esta posición fue responsable de 2 laboratorios con un equipo de más de 300 profesionales desarrollando y manejando un portafolio de investigación con 54 millones de dólares de presupuesto anual, proveyendo una guía técnica y política al Congreso, Trabajo Nacional y organizaciones de industria, así como otras agencias federales. El señor Kohler se ocupa de la gama de seguridad minera y tópicos sanitarios, los cuales traen productos investigados muy útiles para la comunidad minera durante este tiempo resultó en tópicos de seguridad, de sanidad y a muchos gobiernos de diferentes países. Por favor, les pido un fuerte aplauso para el señor Kohler para que nos presente este tema muy importante. Gracias.
Thank you, and good morning. It's really an honor for me to be able to be with you and to present at such a large and distinguished conference that you have here. Also, I had the pleasure of arriving in your country a week ago, and my wife and I were able to tour some of the cultural sites. You have a beautiful country, wonderful people. It's really a pleasure to enjoy your hospitality. I'd like to talk to you today not about researchers and doing research, but I'd like to talk to you about some outcomes from research that has already been performed to talk about how these might help us to improve safety and health in the mines. And I'd like to give you a little bit of background because while I'm now with the Penn State University, when I did this original work, I was with NIOSH, and you've already heard a presentation yesterday from Dr. Emily House, who's with NIOSH, and you have some familiarity with the organization. In terms of my time there, one of the things that I developed was a unique perspective based on congressional expectations in the wake of U.S. mine disasters. And I'm sure those of you in industry understand that when there are unfortunate incidents, disasters, government becomes involved and it becomes very complicated. Societal expectations are also increasing, and we became aware of the need to control safety and health so that we could eliminate these disasters. In that position, I also took a look at the needs and the approaches in different countries throughout the world. We collaborated with a number of mining countries, and we looked at the successes and also the failures of those safety and health systems. You know, taken in total, you know, this work has given me a perspective on what it is that we need to do to continue making progress going forward into the 21st century. I first published this paper in 2015, and it turns out that everything that was recommended in the paper then is 100% applicable today. In terms of the goals of this presentation, I was asked to talk about research and its translation into practice, and I want to share with you some ideas about how this can help us to achieve our industry's goal and society's goal of zero harm. And indeed, I think that, you know, safety and health practices in Peru are very advanced, and you are making good progress toward this goal of zero harm. Nonetheless, there may be one or two things that I can share with you that will provide something useful for your operations. A good starting point for the question of, you know, in what areas will research help us to be more effective is to ask what constitutes an effective national safety system. You know, if we look globally at many, many different mining countries, they all have some sort of a system in place. Some of them work well, some work very poorly. What are the characteristics of successful systems? Well, the first characteristic, as you all well know, is you need a regulatory framework. There has to be some foundation of laws or regulations to establish minimum acceptable levels of performance, to establish certain authorities and accountabilities, and to require the use of certified equipment for specific applications. So a regulatory framework is essential, but it can also be a problem. In the United States, for example, we have a very, very large regulatory system, but it has become too prescriptive, and that is not good either. We don't need a government agency to tell us how to do things. We need a government agency to tell us what the expectation is. And then we will figure out how best to achieve the expectation. Unfortunately, sometimes regulations tend to become too prescriptive and not performance-based. Second important characteristic is enforcement capacity. I've looked at systems in countries which had excellent laws and regulations, but they had zero enforcement. And without some enforcement, it's unfair to all of the companies. You need a level playing field, and so you need an educated and trained enforcement capacity. And by enforcement, I don't mean sending a few lawyers to the front office of the mine and looking at the paperwork. I mean inspectors who can actually look at the practices and ensure that the practices are conforming with the regulations. Training is another pillar of a successful system. All new miners need quality training. There should be task training for specific jobs and annual refresher. It's equally important to ensure that inspectors are properly trained so that they can properly interpret the law and make judgments at the mine site. It's not just miners and inspectors that need training or can benefit from training. It's also supervisors, engineers, everyone can benefit from training. And successful systems are systems that include training for all of those groups of people. And finally, there needs to be a mechanism for technology transfer. So we know a lot of good ideas and best practices. How do we get that out to the mine? How do we get that to the people who are going to use it to make a difference? How many people at the mines have the benefit of coming to a conference like this to learn new things? Only a small percentage. So in countries with good safety and health records, they have a mechanism for transferring technology to the people who really need that information. All right, so, you know, that's very interesting, these characteristics. You know, what does that have to do with research outcomes? Well, we tend to think about the value of research in a very restricted way. We think that research develops technical solutions and new technologies. And that's true. Research does that. But research, in fact, can do more of that. It can contribute to each of those characteristics that I mentioned. Regulations should be based on good science. They shouldn't be arbitrary or political in nature. Where does good science come from? It comes from research. Recognizing that a certain level of regulation is essential, how does one make the argument that risk-based approaches can be more effective than depending only on regulation? Again, research can answer those questions. Training. Where does the foundation come for more effective training? I'm going to say more about this later on. How do we identify the competencies that are required? What are you going to include in your training program? Why are you training? What do you expect the miner to take away from your training program? Determining those competencies can be answered by research. And finally, we can assess the effectiveness of our training through research. Technology transfer. We can use research to look at more effective ways. We can study how people get this information, how they use it. We can look at the effectiveness of the technologies. It turns out, and this will not surprise you, that some technologies and practices that we transfer simply do not work. They simply are not effective. In some cases, government requires that we do those things even though they don't work. We spend money and we get no useful outcome on some technologies. And so research can help answer the question of which are most effective. Where do we focus our time and our effort to make the biggest difference? Well, again, research can help us to answer that question, and surveillance data is a very good place to start. In fact, I have 4 or 5 slides on surveillance data, but I'm going to skip over them very quickly because after yesterday's presentation in the morning, it became clear to me that in Peru, you have a very good system for collecting data. And it appears to me that you use that data to help make important decisions. Nonetheless, as became clear yesterday, by collecting data on all of the injuries and fatalities that occur, as well as new health claims, you can make better decisions about where the problems are and where you should be focusing your efforts. You can look at how things are changing over time, and in fact, you are already doing that, and that's great. You can also use it to rank what the priorities should be. So for example, if we look at the leading causes of surface mining fatalities in the United States and the leading causes of lost time injuries in surface mining, we come up with a list, which is not too different than your list. And also, we can go back 25 years, and the list looks the same, which is not really good news. But in any case, we can use this to prioritize how we're going to spend time and money. And of course, we have a mandatory reporting system, very detailed. You have a similar system in place. But I want to offer up a caution. The Xxiii database, for example, and your database, for example, is really made up of lagging indicators. That is, it is capturing bad things that have already happened. Wouldn't it be nice if we could focus on leading indicators, that is, indicators that would predict whether or not we have a problem that we should address? And so leading indicators are really an important practice for you, if you're not already doing this, to try to implement. Leading indicators, what are we talking about? Things like near misses or high potential incidents, HPIs. Looking at maintenance of engineering controls is a good leading indicator. Worker engagement in certain activities is a good indicator. Indicators that are giving you a warning or a prediction of whether or not you may have a problem that you should be dealing with. The database, the lagging indicators, tell you you had a failure. And of course, it's important to know that so you can address it, but if we want to be proactive and make a big difference, we need to look more at these leading indicators. I also would like to caution you in looking at lost time injuries. There's another metric, severe injuries, which is sometimes a better measure of your safety and health effectiveness. And if you're not familiar with that concept, I can recommend some good papers. And at NIOSH, we began to look at serious injuries as a much better predictor than lost time injuries. All right, so we've talked a little bit about some policy and system characteristics. In looking at research, incremental advances are important, but as has been pointed out today in Glenn Lyle's presentation and presentations yesterday, incremental advances are important, but revolutionary approaches are necessary if we're going to make the kind of change that will lead us to zero harm. Look at the data in Peru, in the United States, in many countries. in recent years, there's been a plateauing. You know, we've made great progress over the decades, but in recent years, not so much. The ranking for causes of injuries and fatalities has not changed very much over the years. These are persistent problems. They are proving resistant to traditional approaches. And then, in addition, future mining is occurring or will occur under more and more difficult circumstances. And those circumstances will involve more hazards. So what are we to do? Well, we need to focus on activities that will lead to improvements across multiple categories, not just one single category. We need to utilize new technologies to address old problems. And I'm going to look at some examples. What should we do? Well, significant evidence has accumulated to support systems-based approaches as a means to achieve zero harm goal. And that the presentation this morning, addressed that very completely. An improved understanding of root causes may help lead to solutions to these old persistent problems. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about root causes. And finally, as I mentioned, technology can offer new solutions, although be careful, technology is not necessarily the answer to every problem, and sometimes new technologies bring with it new problems, new challenges. So let's look at some examples of what I would call game-changing research outcomes, things that have the potential or have already made a difference across many different categories. And of course, number one on my list, number one on Glenn's list, number one on almost anyone's list is we need to move to these systems-based approaches, health and safety management systems. There is no magic pill. There's not one single thing that will take care of the problem. It's a system of approaches. It is behavioral-based safety. It is risk management. It is many different things. Health and safety management systems bring all of these things together under one umbrella. And there's plenty of research already to demonstrate the effectiveness of this approach. And I know that many of you already are believers, but it's certainly something that we need to see implemented across the entire industry in the United States, in Peru, in all mining countries. We need to integrate risk management at all levels, understand the role of the individual components in health and safety management systems. Root causes. Let me talk about a couple of examples. We could use the instance, one of my favorites is haul truck drivers. We teach haul truck drivers, if there is a problem with your truck, stay in the truck. Do not jump off the truck. Stay in the truck. It is much safer. We train our haul truck drivers very diligently in that practice. What happens when there's a problem? They jump out of the truck. What happens when they jump out of the truck? They're often killed or seriously injured. So, is this a failure of the training that we give to haul truck drivers? Well, you have to say yes, it certainly doesn't speak well of the training if after being trained they do the opposite practice. But perhaps we could do a better job in developing training if we looked at a root cause. And a root cause in this case is the difference between the actual risk and the perceived risk. So the actual risk, we understand, is very high if you jump off the truck. Does the truck driver believe that? No. In the truck driver's heart, his perceived risk is that I'm getting out of this truck because it will be safer, better for me. But the important thing to understand is that difference between perceived risk and actual risk, and importantly, how can we communicate that message more effectively to the haul truck driver? And yesterday, Dr. House mentioned briefly some of the research at NIOSH, which is looking at how to improve the communication in these training programs. And so I think that's an area not just for haul truck drivers, but in many cases, we need to come up with an improved way to message these hazards to the workers. And I think there's good research ongoing to do that. Another problem, slips, trips, and falls. It's a persistent problem. If there were only 5 causes, we could fix it. But there aren't 5 causes. How many are there? 50, 100, 1,000, right? 1 million. There are just so many that there's no easy way to fix this slips, trips, and falls problem. But again, let's dig deeper and maybe we can find some insight that will help us to better understand. Lighting. Interesting thing about the human eye. After the age of 20, the lens in our eye begins to darken, and it allows less and less light. If you look at the graph here on the your right, you can see that by 43 years old, the worker is receiving 40% less light. Now, what does that mean? Well, it probably means that the worker is not able to see the same level of detail, which could lead to a slip, trip, or fall. It turns out that different wavelengths of light allow us to see the texture better, to see shape and color. What about the distribution of light, how we spread that light out? That can turn out to be helpful, or it can turn out to make the situation worse. What if we took advantage of our knowledge of the human eye and lighting, and we used it to improve task lighting or cap lamps? Here's an interesting picture. At NIOSH, a very brilliant scientist, John Simarco, first came up with this about 10 years ago. But if you look on your left, the traditional LED cap lamp, you can see the image. And here is a different LED cap lamp where the LEDs have been chosen to provide wavelengths of light that are more aligned with the human eye. Look at the difference in the ability to resolve those two images based on the kind of LEDs used in the lamp. Now imagine if we took advantage of that, not only in cap lamps, but we took advantage of it in task lighting as well, to light up different parts of our workplace. Just an example of the benefit of digging deeper, looking at root causes. New approaches to old problems. The value of risk analysis, is a continuing theme. And, indeed, there are documents like this NIOSH document that talks about using risk analysis to reduce major hazards. And in fact, major hazards are very important and need to be a focus of our attention, but there are so many other applications. Let's consider, for example, musculoskeletal injuries, back injuries, shoulder injuries, arms, hands. What if we could apply a similar technique to eliminate these musculoskeletal disorders. You know, our traditional approach to this, as shown on the top right here, is we target injuries. So when there are injuries related to the musculoskeletal system, we focus our attention there and we try to do something to prevent that injury. But there is another approach, a risk-based approach, where instead of targeting injuries, we target risk factors. So we go out and we look for factors that could contribute to back injuries, shoulder injuries, arm injuries, hand injuries, and so forth. And so the NIOSH has developed a tool, and this tool can be used by non-professionals. You don't have to be an ergonomics professional to use the tool. You can take the tool out into your workplace and you can use it to identify these risk factors. And by the way, I've mentioned some of these NIOSH tools on different occasions. They are available to everyone free of charge. You can go to the NIOSH website and you can download the books, the training manuals. You can download the ergonomics risk assessment tool. All of those things are available at no charge. But this is another example of, instead of focusing on the injury itself, let's look deeper and see if we can address perhaps the risk factors. Technology. Technology is a very powerful enabler. Proximity warning is a very promising area where technology is surely going to make a big difference. You know, on the surface, we have a problem with haul trucks, you know, backing over smaller trucks, backing over people, equipment. Underground, in coal mining, continuous mining machines, haulage vehicles underground, in confined spaces, proximity warning would be very, very important. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about proximity warning. Another technology area which is going to make a difference, particularly in health improvement, are person wearable and real-time monitors, talking about things like silica, diesel emission exposure, other respirable dusts. Let's look at this proximity. This is a really nice slide that was prepared by MSHA. It's available on their website. But for those of you who aren't as familiar with the surface application, the haul truck, inside of the haul truck, this is the haul truck driver's view. So it looks fine. There's nothing there that he can see, and so he can go ahead and move his truck and do whatever he needs to do. Right? In fact, look at what is around his truck outside of his field of view. 2 loaders, people, small vehicles, and we all know the outcome. The outcome is often fatalities. You know, their technology can provide an important solution. Many of you probably have cars, automobiles, that have in them cameras. And you have a screen on you're in the front of your car, you can look at your screen, and it gives you a complete 360 view, an aerial view of everything around your vehicle. Why don't we have that for haul trucks? We could. There are some technology challenges, and manufacturers are working on it, but it's a good example of where technology will provide us with some important advances. But is it only a technology solution? I'm afraid that if we assume that technology will cure all of these problems, we will be disappointed. You know, in fact, if we look at, you know, this particular situation, what we see is we have a problem in cognitive behavior. So take a look at this miner, all right? This miner has to focus on 10 different things. This miner is looking at where the piece of equipment is with respect to the ore that's being mined. He's listening to sounds. He's trying to be aware of where the shuttle car is. How many different things can you think about at one time before you make a mistake? How much attention can you focus on any one task? And so this idea of looking at cognitive memory, cognitive processes is an area of research which I believe is going to yield important information and perhaps help us to better design our workplace and take some of the burden off of the miner. Let me shift now in terms of technology to talk about the real-time person wearable monitors. Exposure assessment. You know, I haven't seen the data for your health performance in terms of respirable diseases, silicosis, and so forth, but I would imagine that you're as concerned about that as mining companies all over the world. You know, noise exposure leading to hearing loss, dust exposures leading to lung diseases, diesel particulate exposure leading to lung cancer. You know, these are all things that technology can help us to better manage. The approach in the United States, for example, historically has been we go into the mine and we sample for silica and other respirable dusts. We send the sample off to the laboratory, and 2 weeks later, we find out what the exposure was. Now, what good does that do us? Not very much. What if, on the other hand, we had a wearable dust monitor that told us in real time what our exposure is? So as a worker, I can look at my monitor and I can see that I'm being overexposed, so I can change my behavior. I can stand in a different location, or I can look at the engineering control for noise or for dust, and I can make a modification. In using this technology, we are empowering the miner to be an active participant in the health, and we're not placing the burden solely on the mine operator. So these person-wearable technologies are going to be very, very important as we go forward. The helmet cam is especially an important piece of technology, and I think that you may have had a presentation on helmet cam last year at this conference, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the problem is this. We have a worker who works all shift and is overexposed. Where did they get that exposure? Now, if they're in a fixed location, it's easy to know where they got the exposure. But what about mobile workers? What about workers whose job it is to move around to different locations during the shift? Where during their work schedule did they receive that overexposure? Why do you want to know? So you can fix it. If you know where they're being overexposed, you can hopefully do something about it, an engineering control or some other solution. So helmet cam is a piece of technology to address that problem. Helmet cam is very simple in concept. On the hard hat, we put a video camera, very small, very light video camera. We put a small backpack on the miner, and the small backpack has a very tiny video recorder in it, and also it has the noise dosimeter or the dust dosimeter. And so now what you know is over the full shift, you can use the Evade software, and over the full shift, you can look at every minute and you can see exactly what the exposure is. And in this particular example, you can see that the exposure really occurred during a very short period of the shift. And using the video capture, you can see exactly where the worker was and exactly what the worker was doing at that point in time. And so this is commercially available. The software is free. It's a very powerful tool to help you in a very proactive way. Okay, so how good is your crystal ball? I'm not sure that my crystal ball is any better or clearer than yours, but I think that I would suggest that there are things that will be done that are going to make an important difference. And I think that first and foremost, we need to do a better job disseminating what we already know. There are a lot of good practices, a lot of good training programs, a lot of good tools that just don't make it out to the mines where it could make a difference. So we have to do a better job in technology transfer or dissemination, whatever word you want to use. That is critical. Incremental and evolutionary advances in both technology and practice will lead to important gains. Things like proximity detection, things like improved lighting, advances in monitoring technology, advances in control technology. Those are things that will make a difference. I haven't talked at all about automation. I think that's a given. We're going increasingly in that direction. But in addition to these incremental advances, we need bold actions. We need to improve both the collection and the use of our surveillance data, and especially the use of leading indicators. We need to incorporate risk management into planning, maintenance, and operations. We need to get to a point where every worker thinks about risk and risk mitigation before they do a task. And we need to apply these systems-based approaches, these health and safety management systems, recognizing that they are systems consisting of many parts. So it's not like a cafeteria where you can pick and choose. Well, I like this particular part of the health and safety management system. Don't like that part so much, so I won't do it. Let me choose this part. It's a system. All the pieces function together. It's difficult to say that any one piece is better or more important. It's the collection which makes it such a powerful tool. Partnerships are essential for success. Partnerships bring varied experience and perspectives. Partnerships allow us to address difficult issues and seek solutions. And partnerships are very important if you want to translate your new ideas and technologies into practice in the mines. Partners should include industry and trade associations. Partners should include government. Partnerships really need to include labor. And then, as appropriate, universities and other non-governmental organizations, manufacturers, and so forth. In the United States, between 2004, 2010 or so, we made tremendous progress on some very difficult problems in noise, in diesel, in explosion prevention. We made progress in areas that no one had ever been able to make progress in, and I was very much involved in that, and I attribute that largely to the partnerships. The different experiences of the mining companies, the mining unions, the government organizations, they all brought an important piece to the solution-solving process. And perhaps the key is, by involving all those people right from the very beginning, we had their support, their buy-in. And once we came to an agreeable solution to all the partners, it was easy to move it out into practice because they already were supporting. We didn't have to now go out and convince them that this was a good thing to do. So these partnerships are really critical if we want to solve these difficult safety and health problems. I think that, we can think more broadly about our partnerships. How many of you have thought of using property and casualty insurers as partners? Or using worker compensation insurers as partners? These are organizations who have a very large stake in your success in safety and health, because your failures translate into costs that they have to pay. In the United States, for example, there were some very important safety practices that were moved forward not by government, but by the insurance companies. Some of the explosion prevention practices in underground coal mines, for example. It was the property insurers who went out to the miners and said, if you do not do these particular practices, we will not sell you insurance. Oh, that's a pretty good lever. And I'm not quite sure how the workers' compensation program works here in Peru, but in the United States, you have to pay, as a mining company, you pay a premium for your workers, and that premium becomes more and more expensive depending on your record, your safety and health record. So you have a real interest in trying to improve your record to reduce your costs. But more than that, you will most likely find that the worker insurance companies are more than anxious to work with you to improve your practices. I was part of a program in Colombia where the workers' compensation insurance company, major company, played a significant and very important role in trying to move better safety and health practices into the mines. And so I know it's a system that can work, and I would encourage you to think more broadly about the benefits of that. And I realize that many of you, most of you in this room, are not researchers. You're practitioners of mining engineering, safety and health. But there's a real benefit to you becoming involved in research activities of universities and other organizations. What can you do? Well, you can provide test sites. You can provide, mines to try out new practices, new technologies. Those of us who have spent time in a university would like to see you take a more active role in the funding of research. In Australia, they have a wonderful model. They pay a few cents per ton into a fund, and the operating companies form a panel, and they use that money to fund research at the universities. And they've funded some very good projects that have been very, very successful. I don't think such an institution does not exist in the United States. I don't think it exists here, but it's certainly something that you as mining operators should think about. And of course, leveraging the work of others. You know, NIOSH, SIMTARS in Australia, MSHA, many organizations, including, you know, ISEM, have done a lot of good work. Don't reinvent the wheel. Leverage that work. Work with those organizations. Partner with those organizations. I can tell you, for example, in the United States, the organization NIOSH would be delighted to partner with you in looking for solutions to certain safety and health problems. And with that, I thank you for your kind attention. And if there are any questions, I will do my best to try to answer them. Thank you.
Muy bien, excelente su presentación. Como siempre, me han encargado una difícil tarea, hacer un resumen. No sé cómo se han atrevido a darme esa tremenda tarea. Modestamente, algunos puntos para luego entrar a las preguntas rápidamente. Debemos asistir a muchos más eventos que agreguen valor a lo que hacemos. Interesante, para tomarlo en cuenta. La tecnología ya la tenemos acá. La tenemos que usar. La tenemos que usar, señores, señoras, señoritas. No hay otra. Pero volvemos de hace 20 años. Acabo de encontrar a un gran profesional después de 20 años. En minería nos conocemos casi todos. ¿Por qué? Porque estamos tratando o intentando salvar vidas. Y esa es nuestra labor y eso es nuestra pasión. Recuerden lo que dijimos ayer. No saben a lo que se han metido, sobre todo los jóvenes. Este tiene que ser una pasión. Ustedes están salvando vidas. No importa la máquina, la tecnología que tengan las organizaciones, sino son vidas de las personas. Entonces la comunicación, la difusión es importante. Lo ha dicho. Tenemos que difundirlo. Hacemos buenos programas y lo ponemos bonito en un cuadrito, lo ponemos en un estante para que ahí esté guardadito. Y esa no es la idea. Tenemos que tener sistemas propios. Es bueno asociarnos, es bueno, lo ha dicho el expositor, tomar lo mejor que hicieron alguien, pero necesitamos investigar, necesitamos ser auténticos y hacerlo nuestro. Yo no les digo dónde comencé, dónde trabajé, eso no es relevante. Lo importante es que tengo, ya les dije, más de 15 años de experiencia y he visto gente morir, he visto gente exitosa y qué gusto el día de hoy ver a profesionales que a pesar de la trayectoria que tienen, vienen para aprender un poco más. Así que con ese espíritu, por favor, levanten la mano los que desean hacer preguntas. Tenemos algún tiempo. Por acá la primera, por favor. 2, de una vez. 2 preguntas. Ok, comenzamos por acá primero, por acá.
Hola, hola. I will try to speak in English. Dr. Collar, good morning. It's an honor for everybody to have you here.
Thank you.
I have a question. Probably it's not your topic now, but I was listening to you talking about the technologies, talking about also operational discipline in general, you know. But based on your experience, what is the grade of importance of leadership and those programs based on behavior monitoring? I'm pretty sure most of the mining and oil and gas companies have here developed it. But when you see the KPIs, basically in the mining sector, you will see a kind of difference. Also, I have to mention most of our companies here have ISO certificates, OSHA certificates, but not enough so far. So based on your experience, please I want to listen to your perspective, your opinion about these two things. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for the question and comments. If I understand correctly, the essence of your question is the role of leadership and how leadership is making these things happen or is accountable for successes and failures. Am I characterizing your question correctly? Okay. All right, so this is, again, this gets back to the talk yesterday and to some extent in Mr. Lyle's talk about the system. And so the system, you know, we think of the gears and the machine, and we have culture is an important gear, we have policy and practice is an important gear, and what's the third critical gear in the system? Leadership. And in fact, if we look globally, we find that leadership is often the most difficult of the three to address. We've learned some things about this in recent years. Leadership has to start at the top. The chief operating officer, the chief executive officer has to believe in these concepts and has to practice. And it moves down through the organization. If there's a gap anywhere in that chain, it will fail. Because ultimately, the mine workers will know whether or not you are serious, whether or not you are genuine. We have an expression in English. You can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the talk. In other words, you have to actually do the things you're saying because people are watching you. So leadership is critical. Leadership development down and through your organization is critical. Again, it's a system. You can do the best things in different parts, but if it doesn't all come together, it will fail. And leadership is, you know, perhaps one of the more challenging things that has to happen. In the United States, when the National Mining Association began their core safety effort, most of the member companies pledged that they would attempt to implement that system. It was the chief executive officers who signed that agreement, and it was the chief executive officers who went back to their companies and made the case for why they needed to make these changes. So I guess to summarize, I think the leadership is critical, and it has to start at the top and then work down.
A ver, la siguiente pregunta estaba por allá. Tenemos tiempo por si acaso para una pregunta más. ¿Alguien más? Ok, allá por favor, señorita, y con él terminamos. Adelante, por favor.
Bueno, primero que nada, muy buenos días. Agradezco esta invitación al seminario. Pertenezco a la empresa UNACEM y mi pregunta más va enfocada al tema de difusión efectiva. Se habló de la difusión en temas de seguridad, de salud y de la tecnología. A eso quiero llegar. Para que exista una buena difusión, tiene que existir una buena comunicación. Tiene que existir un emisor y también un receptor. Ahora bien, ¿cómo logramos que en este caso el receptor o el trabajador nos escuche, nos preste atención? Mi siguiente pregunta también va enfocada también en ese punto. Considera que también es importante la actitud del trabajador, que también exista una confianza entre trabajador y empleador, que también exista este término que está de moda en los colegios, el tiempo de calidad, que también debería también ser enfocado en las empresas. ¿En qué sentido? Este tiempo de calidad, un ejemplo claro sería algún jefe que se siente a tomar un café con algún trabajador y le pregunte cómo se siente, qué problemas tiene, si se siente bien en su empresa y cómo puede apoyarlo en el tema de seguridad. ¿Considera todo esto importante? Gracias.
Yes, thank you for the questions. Let me start with the last question. Yes, absolutely. I believe that that kind of communication is critical. Without a trust being developed between the mine worker and the supervisor, all will be lost. Because the mine worker will feel that you're not serious, and so they will have a bad attitude. Because why should they bother? You're not going to listen to them. You really don't care. You're just choosing to talk about this because somebody told you that you have to talk about it. The miners are not dumb. They will figure this out. So taking an interest in their job, asking them how do they feel about it, how's it going, are there any safety concerns, do you have any suggestions, that will help you to build trust, which is absolutely essential. There's no two ways about that. So that is really very, very important. The other question you ask is about dissemination. And what can we do to improve dissemination? And then you had another question buried in there, which was, how can we make sure that people use the materials that we disseminate to them? Those are very difficult questions. And if I had the complete answer to those questions, I would be very wealthy and very famous. And I am neither. So. But I can offer you a few comments based on things that we've seen in the United States. In terms of disseminating information, one good way, obviously the company itself can disseminate information through its organizational chain. But outside of that, the enforcement agency can be an effective way to disseminate best practices. So in the United States, for example, if a given mine is having a problem with any of the topics, whether it's ground control or machinery or noise, it doesn't matter, the inspectors will offer information. They will say, here is information, or here is a place you can go to learn how to put engineering controls on this machine to reduce noise levels. Or here is a practice that you can use to improve the rock stability. So the enforcement agency has been an important tool. But I think it's also important for the companies to recognize the value. They need to give their supervisors, their engineers, opportunities to have time to look at these materials and then to pass these materials around. You know, coming to conferences like this is important, but when you go back, you need to have a mechanism to talk to your other workers and to share with them what you've learned and what these practices are. Whether or not they take advantage of it, my experience is that people spend time on activities where they believe it will make a difference. If you tell me to do something and I think it's a waste of time because I see no benefit, then I'm not going to spend the time. But if I think there's a benefit, then I'm going to spend the time. So that puts a burden on you. It puts a burden on you to make a case to the workers, to your colleagues, that we need to do this because it's going to make a difference. Look at this. Here we can see that this will make a difference. We need to do this in our operation. So I wish I could give you a more complete answer, but it's extremely difficult topic. It's a topic of continuing research to find better ways to disseminate, better ways to communicate. Thank you.
Excelente por los aplausos. Por respeto al siguiente ponente, por favor, la última pregunta ya la dejamos para después. Necesitamos cumplir el programa y las siguientes preguntas, por favor, quisiera que las hagan concisas, de frente a la pregunta. Bien, invito por favor al señor Ronald Grant, por favor, que se acerque. Ronald, ahí está. ¿Va a salir bailando? ¿Dancing? Ok.
No español.
No problema. Ok. Nuestras amigas que nos visitan nos exigían más psicólogos en la ponencia, ¿no es cierto? Miren, como la magia, la tecnología, lo hemos traído acá a Ronald. Él es licenciado en psicología. Él nos va a hablar más allá del comportamiento seguro. ¿Qué hay más allá? Se nos va a hablar del más allá. Bien, Gan tiene doctorado en filosofía, ingeniería interdisciplinaria, concentración en ingeniería de seguridad avanzada en la Universidad de Alabama. Además, en la misma universidad se graduó como magíster en ingeniería en seguridad avanzada y administración. O sea, siendo psicólogo, se fue mucho más allá. Es asociado de Ciencia, Seguridad y Salud Ocupacional en el Colegio Las Positas. Los cargos que ha ocupado son los siguientes: director de Innovación y Operaciones del Grupo Reflex Consulting, vicepresidente y consultor principal de Xxiii Safety, propietario colaborador de safetydifferenti.com. Ha obtenido diferentes premios, ha sido galardonado. Realmente es bastante largo y no los quiero aburrir con eso. ¿Correcto? Entonces recibamos a Ronald, al señor Gan, con un fuerte aplauso, por favor.
Hola. Is it possible to use one of those mics? Can I use one of those? I don't like standing behind the podium, so. Oh. Hello? Can you hear me? No? Oh, there we are. ¿Cómo estás? Yeah, good. That's the extent of my Spanish, so forgive me. No, which actually leads up a point that I want to say. Talking about systems in the last presentation, thank you for that. There's a lot that has to happen. You know, systems are more than components, right? It's not just like we show up and learning happens. There's a lot of stuff that's happening behind the scenes that make sure you thank all these great people for, especially those people in the booth back there. God bless them, the translators, right? And God bless them because I talk fast. So they're going to have their work cut out for them. But I also think it's important that we recognize we are translators too in our organizations. We translate what's happening at the coalface to the top of the organization. And that's a critical role that I don't think anyone else in your organization is qualified to do. So, hero. So anyways, let's talk about that, okay? Because I think I want to make sure we take a few steps back and understand why that role is critical. Because too often, we think we know what's happening in the organization because we've already written it down in a procedure. But is that really what happens in organizations? No, it's not. I'm going to tell you right now, work is not happening according to procedures in your minds right now. It's just not. Is that bad? That's a separate question. Let's talk about it. So, what is the main cause of accidents? Well, the good news is a guy named Heinrich in 1931 answered the question for us. He came out with a theory that he called the 88, 10, and 2 theory. The 88, 10, and 2 theory said of all the accidents that he looked at, he was an insurance guy, so he looked at a lot of accidents. 88% of them were caused by unsafe acts or unsafe behavior, people doing risky things that they shouldn't have been doing, right? 10% were caused by unsafe conditions, 2% were caused by acts of God. Nothing we can do, right? You must have been a bad person because you're dead now. No, just kidding. But no, this theory is kind of foundational. I mean, when I took my first, I got my first degree in safety, we learned Heinrich because this was This was it. This was the bee's knees. I don't know if that word translates, but I'm just going to say it anyway. No, this was a critical theory. And this theory actually fits with what we see, right? So this is obviously not a mine, okay? But you can see, we see pictures like this all the time in safety, right? We see pictures like this all the time where people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so what do? We create practice as a result of this, right? The practices we create really can be summed up with three basic steps. One, you identify what you want. Safety. We want people to work safely. So here is the way to be safe, right? Then we train them on how to do the thing we want them to do, right? We tell them, hey, do it this way. This is the way to do it. And then three, we create some sort of reinforcement structure, accountability, if you will, right? Some way to make sure that people are doing it, whether it's negative consequence if they don't do it, punishment, or in some cases, we also give them incentives for doing it, right? The foundations of this go back even further than Heinrich. The foundations of this management structure, which is very basic management, goes back to a guy named Friedrich Taylor. Taylorism in 1911, or what is more commonly known as scientific management, created this basic model, right? Figure out what you want, train people how to do it, hold them accountable for doing it, right? And there's some underlying assumptions. So first of all, does this seem familiar? Yeah, right? I mean, this is very, very consistent with what we do in safety. We train people, we have inspections and audits to make sure they're doing what they need to do. We have regulators that then come in and say, you're not doing it, you need to do it, right? We tell people what to do and we hold them accountable for doing it. That's Management 101. There's underlying assumptions here that I want to talk about. The underlying assumptions are that, number one, unsafe actions or risky behavior result from poor choices. People made the wrong choice, right? And so our job is to intervene by changing that individual, changing the way they make decisions, right? That's an underlying assumption of this basic model when it comes to safety. It's so prevalent that we don't even question it. We just do it this way. We just do it. But I think it's time to take a step back and ask the question, is there another explanation for what we're seeing? Is it possible there's something else that's driving our perception that most of our accidents are caused by unsafe acts? Let's go a little bit deeper into the research, right? Fascinating study that happened in the United States in the 50s called, and it's kind of commonly called the Pygmalion effect, right? The Pygmalion effect came from a research project where this researcher took a classroom full of students, grade school students, young kids, right? And he separated the class in half, right? And all he did, he went to the teacher and said, "Teacher, I'm gonna have your students take an intelligence test to figure out how smart they are and how much potential they have," right? And then he gave them the test, right? But here's the thing. He threw away the results. He didn't actually grade the tests. But you know what he did? He told the teacher, this half of the class, these are the smart ones. You're all the smart people. Good job, right? A lot of potential, a lot of room for future success. This half of the class, I've got bad news. You failed the test. You're not going to go very far in life. Just do the best you can, right? Now, note something important here. He didn't tell this to the kids. He told it to the teacher. And you know what happened at the end of the year? This half of the class had the best grades. They showed the most improvement. This half of the class, the worst grades, the least improvement. How did that happen? The guy just randomly separated the kids. He didn't actually grade the test. He didn't actually figure out what their intelligence was. And he didn't tell the kids what their scores were All he did was tell the teacher. What he found was that our beliefs about people change the way we interact with them, change the way we deal with them, we talk to them, change the trust we have in them. And if we believe that people aren't trustworthy, how do we treat them? As not trustworthy, right? I want to give you a model and apply this to safety, and I want to see if it resonates with you at all. Because I think that we create a self-fulfilling prophecy in safety. We are like that manager on the left side of the screen, and we create our rules and procedures that people need to follow. And those rules then are translated to the worker. But if those rules aren't helpful, if they're not realistic, if they're not meaningful to the worker is left with a conflict. They have to get a job done. You haven't provided them anything to get their job done. You've only given them more work to do. And so what do they have to do? They've got to find a way to get it done. And so what do? They have to have a workaround. They have to find a way to get the job done without totally following your procedure. But what does that do for us? It reinforces our belief. We now have proof we can't trust them because we gave them a safety rule, for crying out loud. How dare they violate a safety rule? And now we can't trust them, so we give them more rules, more controls, which then just reinforces the cycle. Now, I'm not saying for sure that this is what's happening in your organization, but I am saying it's another possible explanation. And I want us to start to take a step back and think. The speaker this morning made a really good point, that when we point the finger, there's three fingers pointing back at us. And sometimes we need to take a step back and think about how we're thinking about the problem, because how we think about the problem may be contributing to the problem. So how do people actually behave? What evidence do we have about how people think when it comes to decision-making and cognition and even risk in some ways? Well, we'll summarize a little bit of research, and you'll hear a lot more probably throughout the rest of the day, but I want to do a psychological experiment with you today. Is that okay? Can I do that? Are you on board? You can say no. All right, let's do it together, okay? Because I want to understand this thing that we call human error, all right? So this wording comes from an actual psychological experiment that was done a long time ago, I believe in the 60s, from a guy named Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who is since passed. But let's read it together, okay? So Linda is 31 years old, single, and outspoken. She's very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Lima, meet Linda. Linda, meet Lima. Right? So I'm going to ask you a question about Linda, and I want you to think about it. Which is more probable? One, that Linda is a bank teller, or two, that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? Think about your question, or your answer. You got it? All right. How many of you believe it is number one? Number one is more likely than number two. Can you show me your hands if you believe it? Nobody believes it. Oh, my goodness. How many of you believe number two is the correct answer? Wow, most of you. Good, good. How many of you don't think on Thursday mornings? Good. Okay, good. We've got more honest people. Okay. Good, good. So most of you believe it's number two. You are mostly wrong. The objectively correct answer is number one. Right? The objectively correct answer is number one. Now, I'm going to explain to you really quickly why number one is more correct. I'm going to warn you, it involves math. So if you don't like math, just close your eyes and stop listening for 30 seconds, okay? But here's why number one is the correct answer. I asked you a math question with words, right? I asked you about probability. And the probability of one event happening has to be equal or greater than the probability of that same event and one other event happening. Right? So if you're interested in why number 1 is the correct answer, that's why, because it has to be. You cannot have it. You don't even need the paragraph above that. I just ask you that question, number 1 is always the correct answer. You cannot have number 2 be more probable. Now, if you don't like math, turn your brain back on, come back to us, okay? And let's explain why you chose number 2. Because you made a mistake. You made an error. You need to try harder next time. I'm just kidding, you don't have to try harder. But no, I want to understand it, because here's the thing. Most people, when given this experiment, get the wrong answer. So you're like most people. So you're in good company. There's 2 explanations as to why you got the wrong answer here. The first explanation is that you could be stupid. Okay. Now, I'm not going to tell you you are or you're not. I'm just going to say it's possible. Okay? I'm just kidding. You're not stupid. You're all extremely smart, good-looking people, and it's just those other people who are stupid, right? But no, here, pay attention to this second explanation, because I think it's important. It could also be that making this mistake, making this error, makes it more likely that you're successful overall. Think about that for a second. Why did you make that mistake? If I had to guess, it's because you looked at the information I gave you about Linda, and you used that to create a picture in your mind almost of who Linda is. Your brain filled in gaps that allowed you to answer this question. Why did your brain do that? It's because most of the time when we're having conversations like we're going to have when we go to lunch eventually, when we have those conversations with other people, we don't give them all the information that is possible about what we're talking about. We give them a little bit, and our brains fill in the rest. Like, when I say, ¿Cómo estás? Okay? It's like, how's it going? How's what going? Right? I mean, think about that question. It doesn't make any sense if you just take it at its words, but when we actually have a conversation, nobody ever says, wait, what do you mean? What are you talking about when you say, ¿Cómo estás? Nobody says that, right? We just know immediately what we're talking about. But notice how when we have conversations with people, we instantly answer the question, and sometimes our answer changes depending upon where we're at, right? We do things without thinking because that's the way they're done. We tell people to think more, but we don't really mean it. So like, for example, why are you all sitting in a row pointing in the same direction? Why? Did you think before you walked in and thought, what's the smartest way to sit in this room? No, you just walked in and sat down because that's how you behave when you're in a conference, right? And you're right most of the time until you're not. That's how human beings are. We operate based on context, based on where we're at, and we make guesses about how we're supposed to behave in that context. And those guesses are usually right until they're not. Another interesting example, case study about an accident, actual events that happened, comes from World War II. Okay? The United States in World War II was having a problem where we had pilots pulling up their landing gear after they landed. I'm not a pilot, but I don't think you should pull your landing gear up after you land. That's usually not a good thing because it destroys your aircraft. Now, nobody's hurt, but if you're trying to fight a war, but you're destroying your own bombers, probably not going to work very well, right? So they've tried to figure out what's going on here. And they did all the normal stuff that you would do, right? Let's punish the pilots until we can get them to do what we want them to do. Let's retrain the pilots so they can stop making this mistake. And then they did probably the worst thing you could ever do. They hired a psychologist. They hired a psychologist to come in and figure out what's wrong with these pilots. They must be crazy, right? But the psychologist they hired did something interesting. He didn't talk to any of the pilots. He went right into the cockpit, and he noticed that the control board for the in the cockpit was just full of all these switches. And if you kind of have pictures in your mind of old switches, like the old like silver toggle switches, you know, the little ones you flip, right, with a small little label underneath, under each of them. And he looked over, and the switch that was for the landing gear was right over here, and right next to it was the switch for the wing flaps, which, when he did a little bit more studying, turned out that's what the pilots were supposed to hit in that moment. It wasn't the fact that the pilots were stupid or were trying too hard, but it was cognitive loading similar to what we heard in the last presentation. They're just doing all these things, flipping all these switches, and they just go to flip the switch for the flaps and they accidentally hit the wrong switch. We've all done it, right? How many of you have accidentally deleted an email that you weren't supposed to delete? Right? We've all done it, right? Except in this case, it's a landing gear situation. So you know what he did? He did something interesting. He went to the hardware store and he got 2 pieces of rubber. One he turned into a circle. The other he fashioned into a triangle. He took the circle one and he put it over the toggle switch for the landing gear. And he took the triangle one and he put it over the toggle switch for the flaps. The error went away almost completely. No more instances of pilots doing this. Why? Because this psychologist understood something really important. We can't separate people's behavior from the environment they're in. You don't behave the way you do because you're actively thinking about what the best thing to do in every moment is. We don't have time for that. How many of you tested the coffee they gave us this morning to make sure it wasn't poisoned? Okay, good, we have one. He did it for us. Thank you, sir. You are a hero. Okay, right? No, none of us did. Why? Because it's pretty rare that they poison our coffee, and I would assume none of you have mortal enemies that you know are working at the hotel here, right? We just assume that it's okay and we can trust it, right? But if we went into an environment where we had, I don't know, mortal enemy there, we might then, okay, can we test that coffee, right? We operate based upon the environment we're in. And so if we decide that, hey, wait a minute, all these unsafe acts are happening, we're making a weird distinction because we're actually taking action away from the context it was in and isolating it. And that makes no sense. Now, some of you are thinking, though, wait a minute, Ron, that's all well and good. But what about violations? What about intentional deviations? Right? Error is one thing, people making a mistake. But violation is intentional. Well, we can talk all day about this one, but I want to just give you a model from another psychologist, a guy named John Adams, that I think is just one way of looking at violations that might help us make sense of what we're seeing when people violate a rule. So in the middle, you have our behavior. And all behavior is what we call goal-directed. It's directed towards doing something. We want to achieve something, right? You don't behave the way you do because you just do it. You do it because you're trying to achieve a goal, right? So all behavior is goal-directed, and that behavior leads to outcomes. The outcomes could be a reward or an accident, right? Could be something you wanted or something you didn't want. The rewards, how do we interpret if we get a reward? Well, that leads us to say, hey, wait a minute, that was the right thing to do. I'm going to do more of it, right? And so then that feeds back into our goal-directed behavior. We're going to change our behavior as a result. If there was an accident, though, well, then we would perceive more danger, and that also would feed into our behavior. We would get more cautious. A lot of organizations that are very safety conscious have something really interesting in common. They often had a very big catastrophic event happen to them. You see it a lot. They finally say, you know what, we're done having these catastrophic events, we need to do something different. That's the bottom of that model. Now, if we look at this model and we think about it, what would we predict people would do when we make the workplace safer? they would take more risks. Think about that. That's interesting, right? What this model teaches us is that if we are actively just treating people like robots and not thinking about how they think about what we're doing, and we're not bringing them along with us in our journey towards making our workplaces safer, we may actually be shooting ourselves in the foot in some cases. That doesn't mean we should give up, but it does mean we need to take into account how people think, because people don't violate rules just because they are trying to make us angry. Right? They're trying to do something, and in most cases, this should give us pause. In most cases, they're doing something that you're paying them to do. Think about that. If they're violating a safety rule, they're doing something outside of their own interest to do something that is in your interest. And for you to say that's only their problem is bizarre. Because if you stopped paying them, I guarantee they'd stop doing it. Right? So me saying, okay, well, people just need to follow our safety rules, it's not that simple. We need to think about how they think. So to illustrate that, I want to introduce something that I call the local rationality, people call the local rationality principle, okay? The local rationality principle is based on some fundamental assumptions, and I want to see if you agree with them. Number one, most people don't come to work to get hurt or be killed. Do you all agree with that? Okay, good, okay. If we don't agree with that, we need to have a different conversation. Secondly, most people don't come to work to hurt other people. Do you all agree with that? Yeah, good. Thirdly, most people don't come to work to do a bad job. Now that one might be a little bit hard, because I bet in your mind, when I said that, you got a picture in your mind of one worker, that one guy, right? He's just, oh, that guy, he's a lazy, right? It's that guy, right? But think about it though, people don't want to do a bad job, they just don't, they have a different definition of good than we do, right? Doing a good job is motivating to people. So I don't think people want to do a bad job. There's just a different incentive for them to do the job they are doing, and they're doing a job that's good enough. Lastly, people don't come to work to be involved in incidents. They don't want to get in trouble, right? Do you agree with that? All right, so if we mostly agree with this, we are come to the place of the local rationality principle. So if someone violates your safety rules, things we have to take right off the table is they're not trying to get hurt or hurt other people or cause trouble. Why are they doing it then? That's the question. We need to answer that question. And the local rationality principle says people act in ways that make sense to them at the time based upon their attention, their goals, the resources they have, their experience, their education, the environment they're in, the social group they belong to, their culture. All of these things outside of the individual are affecting what's going on inside here. And so if we want to understand what's going on to solve that problem, we need to understand that complex web of stuff that's influencing their behavior. So what does this mean for us? Going back to our Heinrich model, our 88, 10, and 2. This all means that model makes no sense. From a pure social scientist perspective, this model is arbitrary. Because how do I know what is an unsafe act and what is an unsafe condition when actions influence conditions and conditions influence actions? Right? So the question becomes, wait, where did you draw the line between those two things? Because that doesn't make any sense. And the key way to tell this is, I personally believe it is impossible to describe an unsafe action without also describing a condition. People do not do things that are inherently unsafe. They do things that are unsafe in a certain context. Even, for example, like some of the case studies we looked at earlier today. staying in the cab of the truck versus jumping out of the cab of the truck. Most of the time, when you're in an unstable environment, getting out of there makes a lot of sense, right? So the action itself isn't the problem. It's the action plus the context. That's what we need to be focusing on. So to illustrate, you remember our buddies here? I actually will challenge you on this. I believe there is clear evidence in this picture that these two gentlemen value safety more than production. What's the guy holding the bucket doing? Is he producing anything right now? Is he doing his job? No. He's there for the sole purpose of helping his buddy be safe. Right? We may not like it. I'm not saying it's acceptable, but I am saying the problem isn't that these guys don't care about safety. The problem could be all sorts of other things. Could be they don't have the right ladder. Could be improper training. Could be improper supervision. Could be all sorts of things that we don't know. But the important thing I want to get across is notice how quickly we immediately look at that picture and immediately have a judgment about what these people are doing and who they are when we know nothing about what's going on. And I think it's time that we take a step back and say, wait a minute, what are my biases? What am I bringing to the table that may be influencing what I see? And to challenge you on this, this is something that, this is a homework assignment. I hope this is okay, right? With this picture, or next time you have an accident, ask yourself the question, how would you describe the event or the picture in this case if you could not use the term unsafe behavior or carelessness or inattention? What if you couldn't use those sorts of negative, judgmental terms to describe what you're seeing? How would you then describe what you're seeing? What would your investigation look like? I bet it would change. And I bet you'd come up with different stuff, and I bet it would be better. But don't take my word for it. Try it. See if it works. Another point to consider here that's interesting is we use the term unsafe actions, unsafe behavior, or even at-risk behavior, or any variation thereof. But it's kind of bizarre to me that we say that when we don't even have a clear definition of what safe is. What's the definition of safety? No accidents, right? But wait a minute. If safety means no accidents, can you go a long period of time without having an accident and not be safe? Yes, absolutely, right? So the idea that safety is no accidents is not a good definition. It may be a commonly used definition, but it's not useful for us if we want to make ourselves safer in the future, right? It doesn't help us understand what to do next. It only tells us what happened in the past. But okay, let's go deeper. There's an ISO definition, International Organization of Standardization, right? Their definition of safety is freedom from unacceptable risk. Okay, freedom from unacceptable risk. What does that mean? Well, I would argue then, by definition, all unsafe acts are not unsafe, they are all safe. Because by definition, the person would not have done the action if they didn't accept the risk. Right? I mean, who gets to decide what's acceptable or not? The boss? They're the final arbiter? Why are they qualified? Why do they get to say what's safe for me? Doesn't seem fair, doesn't seem right. At a minimum, it's far more complicated than we're making it. Now, immediately you're thinking to yourself, well, Ron, this is all well and good, but what other option do we have? If we can say that something is unsafe, then what can we do if we need to describe what's happening in our organization? Well, to give a hint of where I want to go with this for the rest of the presentation today, start with that local rationality principle. Ask yourself the question, Why does it make sense for them to do what they did? What makes it make sense? And if your answer is something along the lines of, because they're stupid, you're not there yet, okay? Assume that the people who were doing this action were smart and well-intentioned. And with that being the case, answer the question, why does it make sense for someone who's smart and who wants to do the right thing to do something like that? And until you can answer that question and feel confident, you're not done. You're not done. Now, that doesn't mean you accept what they did, but you need to understand it. You need to understand it, and until you do, you're not done. But let's go deeper. So one way to think about this, I didn't even realize like that. Let's go deeper. That was not intended, no. So something that a colleague and friend named Steve Chirac calls the principle of equivalence. So remember the Linda experiment we did together? Do you remember that? Right? That taught us an important fact, that when we make mistakes, the origin of those mistakes in us is inherently tied to how we are successful. And that's the principle of equivalence. Success and failure have similar underlying conditions. They emerge from the same source. The conditions that come before us being successful will be the same stuff you find after the accident happens. So let me give you an example. So you see our buddy here. This picture actually came from a water utility in Texas, in the United States. Someone sent me this picture along with a news article about it after I did a class for them. And so, I mean, what's going on here? This guy, you know, how smart do you think he is? Mucho? Paquito. Right? Probably not so smart, right? Right? But no, let's look a little closer. One of the things I want us to look at is by looking at this picture alone, you can actually get a lot more information about what's going on. So like, for example, where do you think he is? He's in front of someone's house. He's a water utility worker fixing a leak for water that's going into someone's house. And in fact, the news article pointed out this picture was taken by the homeowner who was there watching him work because she needed to go in to get ready to go to her own job that day. She couldn't take a shower or get ready until he got the water back on. So imagine you're doing your job and someone's there watching you do it. Is there some pressure? And especially if it's a customer like in this case. So right off the bat, there's pressure. What is that hose? You see that hose that's kind of snaking around and underneath him? What's that hose? That's a pump. That's a hose that goes to a pump. That pump is supposed to pump out the water. Why isn't he using it? Is it because he likes to get wet? Maybe he wanted to go swimming. No. What's that board that's underneath his knees? He put that there so he wouldn't get his knees wet. He put it down so he could rest his knees on it while he was trying to do the work. So he didn't want to get wet, so why did he get wet? Because the pump didn't work. The pump failed. And actually, I've done a lot of ride-alongs with water utility workers who do this kind of work, and I've had 3 separate occasions where we've done work like this, and in only one case did their pump work. And it only worked because there was 2 people who started it. One person pulled the handle because it was a gasoline-fed pump. The other person had to hold the wires together on the ignition switch while he was doing it. It was a poorly designed, not designed, it was a poorly maintained pump. So it's not uncommon for this to happen. So this worker's left with a choice. Dive in and get it done, or drive all the way back to headquarters And hopefully there's a pump there that works. But what's going to happen while he's doing that? The customer is there waiting without water, unable to get her job done. And what do we drill into our workers? We drill in our values. And one of the values of this organization is make sure you have good customer service. Just like probably in your organization, you have values like integrity, right? Integrity or something like, some variation of that means, hey, when you're responsible to get a job done, do it, and do it right. But what happens if someone's struggling to do a job? Does their value of integrity ever stop them from asking for help? We don't think about that because integrity sounds good and it looks great on a poster. But it does create conflicts. And our workers are managing these conflicts all the time. They're finding a way to balance the competing goals with the inadequate equipment and scarce resources that we've given them. And not to throw us under the bus, we've given them that stuff because we didn't have a choice. Sometimes equipment fails and it's not always clear why until later, right? But the worker is faced with a decision. Don't do the job or find a way to get it done. What's more valued in your organization? Not doing work or finding a way to get it done? You don't have to answer that question, but I would venture to guess in most of your organizations, people are not promoted for not doing their work, right? Most of the time, they're promoted because they find a way to get it done. We value that sort of integrity, that initiative. Because the reality is real work is messy. So I'm going to give you a model here. Some of you may have seen variations of this, but so this here, this black line is how we imagine work to happen, or what my friend Steve Schrock calls work as prescribed. Right? Work is prescribed. That's what we put in our procedures. That's what goes in our regulations. Is that how work actually gets done? No, it looks a little bit like this. So think about it. Like, think about even like you're getting here to this conference this week. You probably had a plan in your mind. Okay, I'm going to leave at this time, and I'm going to, drive there, and I'll get there by this time, and maybe I'll have time to go get some dinner or something like that, right? Did it work out that way? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes dramatically different, right? Why? Because life happens. Because we live in a world that is uncertain. Our world is constantly changing. Our world is always changing, and it's not always clear how important that change is going to be until later. So like right now, you don't know what I'm going to do next, right? No, but right now, there are a myriad of things happening that could affect us. Most of them will not, but maybe some of them will. How do you know which ones will or will not? You don't. You just do. You just keep acting based upon what you know, and most of the time it works. Now, we keep doing the work that way, but we have this other line that's in our organizations. It's kind of black and fuzzy that I'm just going to call the dynamic safety boundary, or that's you cross that boundary, you get hurt. Why is it squiggly? Because it's not clear when it's going to happen. Why do we tell people to not stand on the top rung of a ladder? Because you can fall. Do you fall every time you stand on the top rung of a ladder? No. In fact, most of the time, you don't, right? So it's not clear to us when it's going to be today, that today is the day I'm not going to fall. You tell your equipment operators to wear their seat belts. Why? To keep them in the vehicle and, in the case of a crash, right? Do you crash every day? No. Most of the time, you don't need a seat belt. But the problem is you don't know when you need a seat belt until afterwards. And so we tell them, black line, do it every time. Do it every time. but we don't know for sure when it's going to happen. But again, real work is messy. And so we repeat the task again and again and again and again and again, and you get this really messy, stringy goo. And you see that at the bottom, there's a couple of times when our blue line crossed that safety boundary. These are accidents. We look at them very closely. And I think that's important. The accidents that are happening in our organizations, we treat them as if they are different than the rest of the time. Right? So like, you're not gonna have an accident today, most likely. Why? What's causing that? What's leading to that? What's driving that? I don't know. I hope it's the stuff we're doing, but maybe it's not. We need to become more curious about what's happening above that fuzzy line. Because in that fuzzy line, you have stuff like bad design. You have stuff like goal conflicts, like scarce resources, like workflows that cause people to work in close proximity that increase the risk. So like, how many of you have multiple work crews working in close proximity with each other where one crew's work affects the other person's work? Probably a lot of us, right? That's not necessarily a hazard per se, it's just work. But can it create risk? Yes. You also have some non-reporting happening in your organization, right? You don't know how many accidents you actually have. You don't. Your workers probably are hiding them from you because they don't like to report those sorts of things. You get them in trouble or you cause trouble for them. There's more happening in your organization than you know. You also have this other line as well. You have innovation going on in your organization. I'll give this back to you when I'm done. You have innovation happening in your organization, and you don't know about it. Your workers are finding a way to get work done and are creating better processes that you don't know about and you're not taking advantage of. That's money you're leaving on the table. We need to get far more curious about what it takes to get work done and what's going on above the fuzzy line. We need to start learning about normal work. So I'm coming to the end here. I'll shut up and leave room for questions, but I want to give you a comparison about how we used to see our systems in safety and behavior and the way I'm advocating we move in the future. So the old way is we used to say our systems are basically stable. They're well designed as is. If people would only follow our processes and our systems and our procedures, then we wouldn't have accidents. Accidents happen because people deviate. And so as a result, what do? We try to control the people. We stop them from doing those bad things. And so the question becomes, how do we change them? How do we fix the people? The new perspective I'm trying to advocate today is actually, no, your systems are not safe. They are always flawed. Sometimes they're flawed this much, sometimes they're flawed this much. And this is not a product of you not trying hard enough. This is a product of life. There is no system on Earth that is perfectly safe. Aviation is one of the safest systems we know about, and look what's happening there over the last few months. It's not because people are not trying hard enough, it's because we need to think differently about what's happening. Accidents are happening when we do not have enough resources in the moment to meet our demands. And so the question isn't, wait, why did you screw up? The question is, how did we not provide what you needed in that moment? Which includes information, includes tools, includes people, right? And then people are not the problem. People have a unique ability to get work done. They adapt and problem solve. I mean, if you want a good example of that, pay attention to the work that's happening all around us throughout this conference, right? I mean, the people around us are finding a way to get it done despite some of the problems we are throwing at them, right? And so what do we need to do? We need to support them. We need to find ways to help people get work done, not to hold them back. So some final recommendations I'm going to leave you with, and then I'll shut up and you can ask me questions if you want, or go to lunch if you want, I guess, as well. Okay. So number one, try to stop using words like unsafe behavior. Just try to take that out of your vocabulary for a while. Try to say something different. Start talking about how people adjust their performance. So instead of saying this accident was caused by an unsafe act, describe what happened. Individual A, used motor B, and the energy source, cut them. Just say that. And then you can start describing, okay, what was driving that? Implement a process to start learning from everyday work. We only learn in safety after something bad happens, and we think that's enough. It's not enough. The revolutionary approaches that I think we need is we need to start being more curious about what's happening now, when nothing's happening. The most dangerous thing to hear in safety is this: nothing. No news is not good news. Lastly, support people. Don't try to hold them back all the time. Ask them for what they need and provide it. So with that, I will shut up. I will surrender my microphone. Oh, you have microphones, so you're good. Okay, you don't need my microphone. All right, I will shut up. Thank you.
Excelente presentación. Por favor, quisiera que levanten, pero por favor, directo a la pregunta, ¿ya? Es más, ya no voy a hacer mi resumen para que ustedes estén más cómodos. Cada uno de ustedes, me imagino que ha encontrado un resumen y eso es extraordinario. Por favor, quiero ver manos valientes. Una, acá. De frente a la pregunta, dos allá. Y una más, si gustan. Si no, nos quedamos con dos. ¿Listo? Acá, al fondo, ya tres. Cerramos ahí. Adelante.
Aló. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Muy interesante. Hizo una pregunta, ¿no? ¿Cómo es un día seguro? ¿Cómo podemos llamar un día seguro? Yo considero que un día seguro es un día no en que no hayan accidentes, sino es un día en que haya comportamientos seguros. Pero cuando me refiero a comportamientos seguros, no es solamente de los trabajadores, es también de decisiones de la empresa que nos lleven hacia objetivos seguros también, ¿no? Quisiera sus comentarios sobre eso.
Yes. Oh. Yes, totally. Good question. Thank you for that. I agree to a point. And here's why. Because it's not easy to define what is and isn't safe looking forward. We have this tendency in safety and in society to think that just because I can look backwards and say what someone should have done after an accident means that I can look forward and say what they should do next. And we have no evidence to prove that that is necessarily true in a lot of cases. An example I'll give you is in the United States, NASA, our space agency. In 1986, we killed 7 astronauts, right? Why did we do that? How did we do that? Well, one of the things we did is we had a risk assessment process to analyze the risks associated with that shuttle launch. It was one of the most robust risk assessment processes you've ever seen. It was a risk assessment process above and beyond everything we've talked about today, right? And they made a decision, this is safe. Now, in retrospect, we know that the shuttle blew up and killed 7 people. So the question then becomes, wait, how did that happen if they thought it was safe? Right? I mean, well, there's a lot of things that we can talk about that case study, but for the question that you asked and for the comment you made, which is a great comment, that is, wait a minute, if they thought it was safe, then if my definition of a safe day is everybody's doing what the safe thing is, how do I know that that's enough? And just because it was enough today, how do I know it's going to be enough tomorrow? These are open questions. And one way we can answer these questions, to kind of piggyback on the previous session, is we need a lot more research in this area. There's a lot that we do in safety that we're not totally sure works, but we've been doing it long enough that we're kind of sure it works. We need to do better at that. We need to get better at figuring out what's actually working and what's not working. Because we have a lot of things that say, do this and you will be safe, And it's not entirely clear that that's true. And that should keep us up at nights. For me, because implied in the comment is, what is the definition of safety then? Is my definition of safety is a capacity or capability to be successful as conditions change. Right? A capacity to be successful in the future. That's more in line with the definition of resilience. And so what that means, obviously, is very specific to the context in your organization. But that's how I would define it. Are we providing what our people need to do their jobs today? That's a better way to look at safety, from my opinion. Thank you.
A ver, la siguiente pregunta la tenemos allá. Concisa, por favor, por el tiempo.
Buenas tardes. Mi pregunta es acerca del comportamiento seguro. ¿Usted cree que parte de este sea influenciado por los riesgos psicosociales?
Yes, totally. Great question. And I would actually say it is far more influenced by what is going on around us in our social environment than what we think is going on in here. Now, that's hard for a lot of people to take because we like to think that we are in control of everything we do. But pay attention to how you behave at lunch today and start to think about why you're doing what you're doing. What's driving you? And I bet a lot of the time you will see that a lot of what you're doing because that's what you're supposed to do in this environment when you're around other people. But if we changed like the people we were around, like imagine now we got rid of all these people and we only had your family here. How would you behave? Or now imagine we got rid of all these people and we only had your boss here. How would you behave? Right? The social environment dramatically affects how we behave, and we need to become more interested in that, in safety, in my opinion.
Ok, gracias. La última pregunta, concisa, por favor. A ver acá. Y por favor no se retiren, quiero darles algunos anuncios importantes, por favor, antes de irnos a almorzar. Adelante.
Buenas tardes. Felicitarlo por su gran presentación. Y mi pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Cómo manejar el estrés de un trabajador en cuanto a un trabajo rutinario?
So how do you manage worker stress in regards to routine work? That is obviously a very complex question. And the way I would begin to answer it is start to ask them what they need. And the question you would want to ask to them and to your whole work crew is, when does stress become too much? Because stress is not always bad. Some amount of stress is good, but obviously too much is too much. So you need to start by having a conversation about where is the stress coming from, how are we managing it, and how would we know when it gets to be too much? Once you start to have that conversation, it actually starts to become more obvious what to do next, but you can't fix anything until you understand it, right? So just saying that there's stress in our organizations is not enough. We need to figure out where it's coming from and what's going on. Does that make sense? A little bit?
Muy bien. Por favor, despidamos al Mr. Grant con un fuerte aplauso. Thank you so much for excellent presentation. Muy bien. Ahora me dan un minuto nada más para darles la siguiente información. El día de hoy va a haber un sorteo, ¿ok? En el break de la tarde va a haber un sorteo por Andes Safety Productos. Andes Safety Productos. Es 2 packs de mochilas. Para participar necesitamos que se acerquen al stand, le van a entregar con un ticket y en lo posible traten de dejar una tarjeta, sino sus datos. Bien. Adicionalmente, para el día de mañana, que lo pueden hacer el día de hoy, va a haber 2 sorteos. Uno, organizado por Neuro y GP Consultores. Los premios consisten en lo siguiente: una capacitación, un neuroshop en neurociencia aplicada para accidentes fatales, duración de 4 horas. Y luego van a sortear una licencia para la realidad virtual aumentada por un periodo de 1 mes. Exactamente lo mismo, se acercan a la empresa y se registran, les entregan un ticket. También la empresa CERB, ellos van a sortear un visor de realidad virtual de 32 gigabytes. Igual, tienen que acercarse, registrarse para que ustedes puedan entrar al sorteo. Deseo que tengan un excelente almuerzo, descansen, compartan y nos vemos, por favor, ¿a qué hora? No se me vayan. A las 2:30 de la tarde, en punto, por favor. Gracias.